a panel discussion to close off this morning's session before our breakaways, and hopefully it'll help you decide which breakaway you want to join for the afternoon session. And it's all about leveraging opportunities for inclusive growth in the socio-economic transition. And Charlotte Mokoena is joined on stage. One of our panelists is Steve Nichols, and he was recently appointed the head of mitigation at South Africa's Presidential Climate Condition, the PCC, which we often hear about in the news. And he's also an advisor to the National Business Initiative supporting their just transition pathway work. And the two of them are joined by Wendy Poulton. Wendy is the Director of Strategic Mindsets, a company that specializes in strategy and risk consulting and coaching. And before that, she was General Manager of Organizational Strategy at Eskom. And actually, her main area of technical expertise is in the energy field, where she has worked for more than 30 years. So let's welcome our panel. Thank you so much. Let's dive into this. We already actually have questions on our virtual platform. As you know, we will open the forum up to the rest of the room, but we have some eager delegates that want to know more from the three of you. But Steve, I want to start with you. Tell us more about the Presidential Climate Commission, just a little bit about its work, what informs the PCC, so that we get a sense of the role that it's playing in the context of socio-economic transition.
Sure, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. So the Presidential Climate Commission is a set of commissioners appointed by the President from each of the social partners. So there are commissioners from business, from labor, from civil society, from government, and then some special commissioners from youth and the faith movements and some other key sectors. And their role is really to inform the President or advise the President and Cabinet on issues of socioeconomic transformation in relation to climate change, and in particular on achieving the just transition. And so we have released guidance on what we think a just transition is. It's called the Just Transition Framework. It was adopted by Cabinet and in theory should flow down through the various planning systems within government, but also should really be influencing the way that other social partners act as well.
Right. Charlotte, you've just been outlining Sasol's strategy, but talk to us about yes, that's what the core business is all about, but I want to hear more about what you're doing through social investment as far as the just transition is concerned.
No, thank you very much. Some of the examples of the programs I alluded to are programs to respond to the workforce. We've just had a transition in 2021, 2022, and we tested a program called Ntsika. In that program, it was about a 14-month program for employees impacted by restructuring. And we put them through a system where they elect to either go to another role, go to another job, or actually go into self-employment. Mm-hmm. The Ntsika program, just in short, had skills development, business incubation, and some startup support. And to that effect, we have actually created 25 startups in 14 industries, and impacted some 60 and created 60 jobs. So even some of those employees have hired other employees that had exited. That's one example. Bridge to Work is an employability program. We take youth out of TVETs or out of school, displaced adults that left roles, and you put them through training. An example is IPEPE. IPEPE, you get through training in agriculture, and then you get implements and startup support, and you get business incubation, as well as access to land. And we're now working with one of the companies that is here to actually ensure that they've got aggregation and market access. Those are two examples for the workforce, as well as that. And I can give a lot of examples on SME development to prepare them for transition.
Right. Oh, right. Because obviously after Miriam's talk, there's great concern about the impact that this is going to have on the economy. And it's not just about the 28 individual employees, but we know the ramifications to the people that depend on them. But Wendy, as companies negotiate this transition, right, especially those that are directly involved in the just transition, what should they be doing to ensure that it's sustainable as well as results in inclusive growth?
So I think all businesses are impacted by the energy transition, as Charlotte was asking earlier, raise your hand. So I think certainly all businesses can do things around energy efficiency. But I think those that are directly involved, there are two major areas, and I loved what Charlotte said earlier about collaboration, and I'll come back to that. But I think also it's around looking at their business models and being very deliberate about how you integrate the energy transition into the business model. It's not an add-on. It's not we'll do our strategy and then we'll see what the impacts are, as if it's a risk. And although it is a risk, it's also an opportunity. And so it's really trying to get transformative transition that helps businesses find new ways of doing things, new value chains, localizing their value chains within South Africa or within Southern Africa. And then I think I wanted to talk a little bit about skills development, because I think that's going to be a very big stumbling block for the just energy transition. I'm Secretary General of the South African National Energy Association, and we've just finished a report on energy skills in South Africa. And one of the big areas that we found was that we focus a lot on technical skills, which absolutely we have to, given also I think that a lot of our people are going to get poached by overseas companies as we start ramping up with renewables and and other just transition technologies. But we also need to focus on what they call vertical learning as well. So not just horizontal skills and competencies, but development of people to be critical thinkers, to be problem solvers, to be able to be agile in this very VUCA world that we find ourselves in. And I think business has a huge role to play in that, and I think collaboratively as well. I agree 100%. In our study, we found that most of the work that had been done is very narrow. And we're not looking at this country-level picture around what can be done on skills. And just one example of a good example there is that the Energy and Water SETA has recently launched a platform for all the other SETAs to work together with DHET to map out what the skills for the just energy transition are going to be. Yes. Instead of competing, collaborating to make sure that we get the skills in the right volume when we need them.
Yes, and we obviously get that critical skills list annually.
Yes.
So that can help to contribute to that.
Right.
Steve, can you tell us more about the opportunities that are available to companies as far as the just energy transition is concerned, and how they can support the process? But I'm also looking to just hear more about the National Business Initiative within that.
Sure. So, I guess we should frame that question in how significant the change is. And there are two things that we need to think about in that framing. One is the climate change impacts, and the other is the social ownership impacts. And so inequality in South Africa is a major problem. And the only way we solve that problem is transferring wealth to the poor, because the access to capital and ownership of capital is the primary driver of inequality. Climate change is also a huge exogenous risk. If you just look at trade, for example, our top 6 exports are coal, platinum group metal, gold, iron ore, steel, and the internal combustion engine. Now, in a global economy that's changing and demanding different things, that's going to have an enormous impact on our economy. Particularly on our balance of payments, our ability to manage debt, our ability to pay that debt back, and therefore the cost of capital. So we're in this very precarious situation, but your question was about opportunity. And so if we look at the amount of money we need to invest in our economy in order for it to be a competitive, net neutral, climate competitive economy, it's enormous. So Miriam mentioned the JET investment plan earlier. That plan was born out of the partnership, which is $8.5 billion, right? Sounds like a lot, but that plan is for expenditure of $90 billion. Just in electricity, electric vehicles, and hydrogen, right? And so if we expand, if we take the E out of just energy transition, someone said earlier we should take the E out of ESG. If we take the E out of, and we just think of the just transition, there's a huge amount of other sectors that will need similar types of investment. And we need thank you. And we need to think
You're going to have to explain that, okay?
And we need to think about the role of the private sector in stimulating all of those sectors. Government balance sheet is not in a healthy state. We see that in Eskom's debt, we see that in government debt. And so the private sector is going to be a very important stakeholder in stimulating all of these sectors. And we need new things we don't make now. The illustration I like to use is, even if we do a one-for-one job swap in coal losses, right, and we create those jobs in renewable energy, unemployment in Mpumalanga will still be 40%. Right? And so unless we can create other value chains and other industries, a kind of green industrialization strategy for the province and the country, we're still going to have those massive levels of unemployment. And then how we do it is important. So when we're stimulating those industries, the private sector has to be able to create new sectors, new companies that are not owned by that particular private sector investment. The transition of ownership has to be to people who work in those areas so that they have capital and they can address these inequality issues. So the question about the role of the National Business Initiative, Charlotte mentioned Impact Catalyst, but there are a whole bunch of players that are working in these spaces, seeking to create partnerships, seeking to create very practical ways to invest in these new sectors and in these economies. And the NBI is one of those. They also work in some big partnerships in Mpumalanga, but around the country. I should make the point that the internal combustion engine transition is a big risk for South Africa. 60% of our vehicle exports are sold to the EU and to the UK, and both of those jurisdictions have banned the sale of the internal combustion engine post-2035. That's not very far away. New vehicle development cycles are 10 years. So unless we start making those changes now, we are not going to have the vehicles to put into those markets, and we may lose huge jobs there. And where does that happen? In the Eastern Cape, right? It's not just about Mpumalanga. So we have to shift our focus a little bit to a countrywide economic green industrialization program. And also be extremely practical about it. So it sounds like a contradiction. We're going to have this big picture, but actually we need to do very specific practical things. They're kind of hand to hand. If we don't understand the big picture, we're going to do the wrong practical things. And it's places like the National Business Initiative that sort of bring these stakeholders together to focus on these very practical things.
You wanted to comment?
I just wanted to add, I agree totally with it. I think there's also a very good synergy within infrastructure. We talk about having certainty from a policy perspective on renewables so that we have a workforce that can move from one project to another. But construction skills can be also utilized in road construction and railway construction and telecommunications and all kinds of other things as well. So I think that integration is really, really important.
But I think yeah, go ahead.
I was going to jump back in. Adding to that, if we're going to meet the renewable energy goals that we have, right, we're going to have to build a lot of wind towers. We're going to have to build a lot of wind blades. We're going to have to make a lot of pop rivets, right? We have to make a lot of cable ties. Apparently there's like 1 million cable ties in a wind farm, right?
Wow.
And so these are the opportunities that we have to understand and uncover. It's unlikely that we will be competitive in building wind turbines in the next 5 to 10 years. You're competing with the scale of China and the innovation support that US companies would get. But cable ties we can do.
Right. Okay. You mentioned obstacles to things like that investment fund, right? So I'm interested in some of the other obstacles in this process. So the opportunities are there. We're talking plans. Plans always sound great, but what are the obstacles that could potentially, not potentially, but that we already have sight of?
I can give it a go. One of the things that are really important is to have one industrial plan. I think Stephen alluded to it and Miriam alluded to it. Otherwise, we're all going to work from 10 plans. And that's why the PCC is so instrumental in working in Mpumalanga to come with one economic plan for that province. Because as an example of one province that is negatively impacted. And also come with other economic plans for other provinces that have opportunities to create new industries. So we need an industrial policy that put the national interest first. In other countries, when this is happening, you have a lot of support through other instruments. The second, so industrial policy, the first one is an economic plan that everybody can work with, and as Steve said, practical. Not lots of things to 2050, lots of things to 2030, because we have to start now, because there are long-haul industries, they do not turn around very quickly. The second thing that we actually need to repurpose our funding. And that's the reason why in this platform, the Trialogue platform, we're having this conversation. We cannot continue doing the same CSI investment the way we used to do it without collaborating, without looking at opportunities. The other one that we need to do is industrial policy for national interest, where we are actually looking at the competitiveness of the country so that we can take up opportunities that are there. And in the emerging industries, we need to open up and say, we're going to move away, and I always exaggerate about painting schools as an example. We're going to move away from painting schools to generate a community of school painters. It's not our work to paint schools. So when you do that, you free up people to be economically active. So we need a people-centered just energy transition, and people-centered energy transition, and a people-centered economic transformation. We need to diversify, as we did in the past. We need to, again, diversify the economy of South Africa. So it's big, but it's also one family at a time. And we need to collaborate. That's another one.
So,
Totally agree. Sania does an energy risk report every year, and the framework that we use, we call it people and the 4 I's. So people are at the center because it's people that make decisions, it's people that are corrupt, it's people that do everything. And then the 4 I's are impact, integration, innovation, and implementation. And I think you need all of those. We can't just have planning, integrated planning. We've got to start implementing better. And be very deliberate about the impact. So don't implement in these little silos with everyone doing their own
thing. For the headline.
Have a big impact and combine our efforts in those really big impact areas. And I find that that's where we're missing, because even if we have an integrated industrial policy, it's still got to talk to the energy policy and the education policy and all the rest. And that's where PCC is doing some great work about bringing those collectively together at one point. But you've got to have all 4 of those I's for us to be successful.
Right, all those pillars. Steve, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I can add maybe 2 or 3 key things around the implementation. One of the big challenges for making these transitions is access to capital. And I think there's a unique role for philanthropy and CSI in that space, particularly on the side of risk-bearing capital. So there are a lot of opportunities in Mpumalanga that are just sub-commercial. A little bit of extra investment to kind of get them into that bankable feasibility phase, and then you'll get lots of investment. So some of the work that we're doing is trying to identify these clusters of opportunities. So take a sector and a subsector. So it's very hard to work at this level of agriculture in Mpumalanga, right? What are we doing about the macadamia nut industry in Mpumalanga? And how do we stimulate that? So there are lots of jobs created in that space. There's lots of export markets created in that space. But the big challenge for entrepreneurs in that space is they can't get their businesses going because they can't get that early stage risk-bearing capital. And I think that's something that CSI and philanthropy can really do. If you understand these value chains, the way to strategically leverage this capital, it can make an enormous difference.
Right, so that was actually going to be my next question, the opportunities that are available to corporate social responsibility or to even NPOs. Any other thoughts beyond Steve's contribution?
I think it's important. One of the things that we do, we all pay consultants for the same pieces of information and pieces of work. So in collaboration, we take that out. I don't have a problem with consultants. They do great work and they add a lot of valuable inputs. The work that we did on the just transition at NBI was actually facilitated and supported by consultants. However, when you do CSI and you do a study on GBV in Sasol, and you don't make that information on an open source, somebody's going to go to the same consultant to pay for the same thing, which is a double investment. And the work that was done on skills for STEM, we looked at at Wendy and them for STEM. That information is open source, you can get it, you don't have to pay for it again, which means it leverages the CSI rent, it goes further. So if you're going to conduct a study for Sasol, for the Sasol node, all of the corporations that are sitting in Sasol, including retail and telecommunication and banks. Every single person here has a footprint in Sasolburg. I'm picking a Sasolburg example. And we all collaborate on what is the economic value of this place. And we conduct a study and we collaborate. It's not your whole 10 million rand fund that has to go in there. Everybody collaborates, we set up a unit, we do a study, we work with the local government, we work with the NBI, we work with all other enabling platforms, and we get access to research that already exists, Maryam, Wendy and the colleagues, the PCC, and then we activate that study around Sasolburg, all of us. Then we actually have one piece of plan that we can all now dip into: health, community development, water articulation, road infrastructure, security. But now we don't. We all want to be on the headlines, and then we spend money where it's not required. I promise you, every time I see a CSI advert, I just want to pause and take a deep breath. Like, why did you spend money on advertising? It's not actually necessary where the country is right now. The most important thing is getting feedback as you watch that rent, the CSI rent go further. As CSI, we need to go back to the business and say, we have to do things differently. We cannot continue painting schools. We are needed slightly differently, and we need to collaborate. Let's not compete for headlines.
If you have a question or comment to make, please raise your hand as we're dedicating the rest of the segment to your contributions. It's been a little bit quiet today, so remember yesterday we promised that we'll afford half the opportunity, the panel opportunity to people on the floor. But while we get the mic to you, I just want to share the comments coming in on the virtual platform. Claire Momet says, here's a thought. Shouldn't coal supplying countries or countries supplying coal or other pollutants be held accountable in some way for the amount of pollution generated in receiving countries, or contribute towards policies to address pollution there or share in their carbon tax? I guess maybe coming back to that just and how that just then is interpreted or how it kind of plays out. Any thoughts on that comment?
Steve, I'll yield to you at the national level.
I mean, the question of international justice and climate change is super interesting. And basically the reality is that all of the damage caused by climate change, it falls on the industrialized countries, right? They caused it, but it's the developing countries that bear the brunt of the damage. And so who should pay for it is a really tricky question, and it's a big debate within the climate change negotiations that happen at the end of every year. And there are a lot of similar measures to what was suggested by the online user to help transfer that wealth from rich countries to poor countries so that they're able to transition their economies, and the $8.5 billion JET IP is part of that, but there are other mechanisms as well. The thing that we have to worry about more, I think, is what happens bilaterally. So the EU have passed this law called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM for short, which basically limits trade to products that are low in carbon intensity. And we are one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to those trade restrictions because of our carbon-intensive electricity system. And so there's actually kind of a flip side to that. The actual restrictions on emissions and who gets to emit is decided in those trade agreements. And we have to watch those very carefully and make sure that as developing countries, we stand up for our rights in those transactions.
Sure. Let's go into the floor, and we've got a question.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Megan from the Hollywood Foundation. So more just a comment, and it's not specific to the conversation right now, but just with Charlotte just speaking again about collaboration. I feel like that's been a strong theme. It is a conversation that we've been having for years. And I think again and again we come back to looking at the amount of investment that goes back into addressing societal ills, which thankfully Trialogue has been tracking for 2 decades. And we're able to see, okay, billions and billions are getting invested, but we're not seeing the change in progress that we would like to. And something that the gentleman from NECT in the previous panel mentioned was Integrated District Improvement Program, which ties into a bit about Charlotte's statement about Sasolburg and looking at that stakeholder map, right, and getting all the parties involved to then find solutions for Sasolburg. My question is who's really responsible in driving this? Is because we keep speaking about collaboration and not wanting to fly, particularly from the corporate or private sector side, is flying our flags high. And I feel like the people in the room here are the collaborative type. But where are the barriers? Where's this resistance coming in that we're not seeing that actual, we talk about collaboration, but again, the step further to implementation. So it's a rhetorical question, probably, in this context.
I think it should be, then let's open it to the floor.
Yeah.
If anyone on the floor, anyone who's here as a delegate wants to respond to that, because it's yet another provocation to the group. If anyone wants to take that, we'll also take your comment on it. There was also a hand in that end.
Hi, sorry, not so much a response, but maybe just to expand more on what the other speakers said, and it's a thought that I've had when I attended this conference previously as well, is that we currently have corporates that are setting up ESG divisions or departments within their companies, and I get the specialization or the need for them to own the environmental impacts and the governance issues. My concern is around the social issues. So you've got NPOs that have track records and are experts in what they do in addressing social issues. And yet, instead of supporting those NPOs and leveraging off their expertise and knowledge, you go and set up a social unit within a corporate setup. For example, I mean, the programs that have been spoken about and showcased are great and really admirable. But the truth is that some of us have been doing that for decades. So what some corporates might think is pioneering innovation in the social space is stuff that NPOs have been doing for years and have gathered evidence over years. So I think there needs to be a shift in mindset with corporates about how we can leverage off the expertise of NPOs and partner and still tick the boxes for ESG indicators, because the work is being done already.
Right, thank you. And let's come to the side of the room.
Good afternoon. My name is Moshe Apleni. I work for Spur Corporation. Perhaps my biggest takeout in the last 2 days has been, firstly, what you've done after every session, the pause. And I think Sis Charlotte has just said it now again. I think it's very important to pause. We've been talking about it at our EXCO, the importance of a pause, because sometimes we're reacting and we want to tick whatever box, but perhaps what I'm hearing here is that we actually need to pause. And what Prof. Nikki Roberts said is, maybe don't come up with a new thing. Deepen what you're already doing. That's my biggest takeout.
Thank you for sharing that. Put that on the virtual group, and let's see the response that you also get to that. There's another comment on that end.
Hi, Gordon Lang, the man that clapped on his own earlier
yes.
on. When
we need
Steve
answers,
took
Gordon.
Out of energy transition. And it was touched on. Charlotte touched on it. Steve spoke about it. The issue of a focus on a just energy transition means that we're focusing in the short term on just that, the energy transition that's going. And the transition that was spoken about is a transition that is much broader than that. It's a countrywide transition that's needed. If we're going to address the 44% unemployment, the 44% that don't have access to opportunity, we've got to look at it from that perspective. The other danger of the just energy transition is that we focus on the short term in the energy space. And the NIP is speaking to a 50-year plan, which may well not be what we need. The IPCC's AR6 synthesis report says that what we do today and tomorrow determines how our children are going to be able to live and decide what their futures are. So if we're locking out approaches that are desperately needed by the short-term focus, then we're creating major other problems for ourselves down the line. And I think we've really got to look at that. And Steve knows some of the area that I focus on. But any transport plan that's done now locks us in for 30 to 50 years. So we really have to look very carefully at how we're planning those mega projects that are going to benefit the country in the longer term rather than in the short term. So that's why I was so happy about E being taken out of the just transition, because it's massively important for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There's another question coming in virtually. Sanele Kulu from Momentum Metropolitan says, my question is, we know that coal-powered energy generation was a solution a long time ago, and it is now a problem. Are we prepared enough to deal with the fact that renewable energy may be our future problem too? So who can look into that crystal ball? But also, once again, we're reminded that they're not competing narratives, right? That we shouldn't fall into the trap of forcing these two to compete, but rather that this is a coupled solution and an approach and a way forward. Does anyone want to comment on Sanele's comment there? Okay. Too big. Too far into the future.
I think that there are 9 billion people on the planet. Any solution that we provide is going to have an impact on the environment.
Yeah.
And so we shouldn't be naive about renewable energy as being a no-problem solution, right?
Or silver bullet.
Yeah, there are a lot of issues with renewable energy. You would need about 1% of South Africa's land surface area for all of the wind farms that we need for the projected amount of power that we may demand. That's about the same amount of space that is under forestry in South Africa. So it's a big piece of land, and there are issues with that. There are environmental issues. There are cultural issues. Whose land is it? How do we get that land? But if you compare it to the damage caused by the alternative, it's a fraction. And maybe there will be things that are further down the line that we haven't predicted. But for the information that we have now, it's by far the best option.
Right.
Yeah.
Another question, Jay Naidu says, Jay is from Chemistry in Action, and Jay says, what are the top 5 CSI initiatives that will create the quickest transition to economic well-being, and how can focus be driven to those 5 focus areas such that all CSI initiatives are working towards the same end goal? So once more, this issue of focused effort, but really saying the top 5. Is it possible to even identify those?
It depends how you look at it.
Okay.
You could do the top 5 at a national level. You could do the top 5 in your sector. You could do the top 5 in your geography. And where those 3 intersect, it's a sweet spot for intervention. And they don't have to be 5, they could be 2. And also, who are the players? There's been an input on NPOs, consulting firms, cooperation and collaboration platforms, CSI organizations in a geography or in a sector. It just depends how you look at it. So I don't have an answer. What we are doing as Sasol, we're looking at it as a geography, which the Mpumalanga as well as the Western Free State and Ekangala, which is Northern Gauteng. We're looking at it that way and saying we're going to impact these communities. That's one lens. We're also working in the Minerals Council because we actually are impacted with coal production and coal usage in our feedstock. And we're also in the Energy Council of South Africa, but also a cooperation in the MBI. So you have to keep on looking at what is the best way to intervene. Right now we are working with Impact Catalyst because they are able to cross all of them, national, sector, geography. And that's why we went for one platform. Where we collaborate with other companies, especially in the mining space.
Yes, yes.
So those are the lenses we can look at and look at partners, either in the sector or in a geography or national if you have the muscle.
No, that's helpful as an approach.
Yeah.
I think the other one is temporal, over time. So, I mean, I agree with what the gentleman was saying earlier about the long-term, short-termism of it. So in the short term, we have it's an interesting trade-off that's going on at the moment between do we put renewables in to help us with our current energy security issues and to replace our coal plant, or do we put them for green hydrogen in the longer term? And how is that transition going to happen, and how do we collectively make sure that is in the best interest of the country and we don't have unintended consequences? Because if we have a limited investment pool in the country, we're going to have to decide when we make those interventions. And so I think certainly over time it's going to change towards green hydrogen. And just to add to what Steve was saying earlier, I was at a green hydrogen event yesterday, and somebody was saying that a lot of the skills in the car manufacturing industry can be very easily translated into the hydrogen space, hydrogen production space and green ammonia space. So it's finding when certain things are going up and going down and trying to make sure that we have those nexus points over time. And in our skills roadmap, that was one of the most difficult things that we grappled with, is that we're not able to project into the future enough to be able to be proactive now to make sure that we address the risks in the longer term.
Yeah, and I think it's that inability that creates anxiety.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that means you've got to be more agile. We can't have these fixed plans. We've got to have things that can move.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's all very mature because it's frameworks and so on, but I'll stick my head out and say the one thing that we really need to be investing in is institutional capacity, particularly at local government level. Someone asked about the major barriers. Some of the biggest challenges in implementing these systems is local government capacity in the areas that you're trying to work. And they are the ones that are actually responsible for these development plans, working with provincial government. And so unless they have the capacity to implement those plans properly, they tend to fall apart. And what happens in the private sector is our temptation is to create a parallel institution. I'm going to take that away from government and I'm going to do it separately. We see it in schooling. I'm going to set up a skills training facility in a town where there's a TVET college, but I'm not going to work with a TVET college because it's not very well functioning. Unless we invest in the functioning of that institution, you're not creating sustainable solutions. So if there was one area that I think we really need to focus on as a country, it's that broad institutional capacity.
Yeah, I think after Nikki Roberts' lecture, I think we all are kind of aligned on the fact that we need to support or align what we're doing with government's efforts and what already exists. That's definitely a big takeout for me. Where are our ushers? Are there any more questions? Right. There we go, yes. And then there's another one here, then we'll wrap.
Hi, I don't have a new question. I just wanted to pick up on the earlier question around is renewable energies not creating a problem for the future? And my comment is that that future is not as far away as we may be tempted to think. Because if you think about wind turbines, those have been in commission for a long, long time. Some of them are reaching end of life. And they're not very biodegradable. So what do we do with those? Solar panels, not very biodegradable. What do we do with those? So all I'm saying is that that problem might not be as far away as we may think.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Another question?
All right, afternoon, everyone. So you'll have to note I'm not really brave enough to ask this question, but I just have to ask it. So you'll excuse the stuttering. So on my case, I'm asking in terms of the impact, Already we're faced with costs, to repair the existing, power infrastructure. So I'm just asking in terms of now powering the transition. Obviously, to start with, we might need to rely on the current grid. And I just want to know in terms of that, if there's expectation of, maybe putting more strain to transition so that we produce all the necessary infrastructure for that, for going green. Do we at any point plan that we can have at least a green plant power the rest of the journey to transition? Because, to start with, obviously, we have load shedding, and I think, obviously, depending on the pace in which we're going to want to push this transition, it will determine, the kind of power we would need from already an existing power stations that are struggling. So I just want to know, in terms of that, if we are expecting that we're going to need more power to power the transition, are we expecting to actually now transfer that needed power to the green plant?
Got it.
If it makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Steve?
Yeah, so if I understand the question properly, electrification of the economy is key to a competitive economy. And so demand for electricity will increase over time. As a simple example, in order to solve climate change, we need to switch to electric vehicles. If we switch to electric vehicles, that's a greater demand for electricity at different times of the day, and so you need to adjust your electricity generation system to compete with that. If we're going to sell green steel or steel products into Europe, it needs to be green steel, which means it needs to be run by hydrogen that's made using renewable energy, so it's a bigger demand for renewable energy. And so we will have a huge additional demand for electricity, but in order for us to be competitive, it needs to be green electricity over time, to the extent that most of the models, there's work being done by the NBI, there's work that's been done by the CSIR, and there's work that's been done by UCT, say that we need to build roughly 6 gigawatts of renewable energy every year, right? That's more than we've built so far. It's built that every single year until about the mid-2030s, when we need to start building 8 gigawatts a year to cope with the increase in electric vehicles, until about the mid-2040s, when we need to start building 12 gigawatts a year to cope with the green hydrogen demands, right? And these things are necessary for us to have a competitive economy. And the opportunity in that is enormous, right? That's lots of jobs, that's lots of investment, that's going to drive a lot of GDP, it's going to enable competitiveness. But of course it does have some downsides that we have to manage, and the point about waste is well made. But yeah, that's the general pressure that there will be on us electrifying to stay competitive.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wendy, did you want to?
I just wanted to add that I think we just have to think about the economic life of our assets as well. We often talk about the transition end point, and we don't sometimes talk about how we're going to get there and what some of the options are. And Miriam was talking earlier about, perhaps life extending some of the coal plants, etc. We have to be aware of our current circumstance and get the best economic value out of our assets that we have at the moment in order to be competitive in the long term, and that may require some trade-offs. So the green journey is not the same for every country, and I think we have to find a path that balances all of those things for us.
Right. Let's hear it for our panel. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. Thank you for being part of this discussion. I must say that for me personally, I feel so much more well-informed about, please receive your gift before you sit. There we go.